I also strongly believe that we want to make sure the No Child Left Behind Act continues to work. You measure every day. That's why you're successful business people. I mean, you know what your business is doing. I believe we ought to extend that same principle to our public schools and ask a simple question. Can a child read at grade level? And in order to determine that, that's why you measure. And if the answer is yes, we all say, great. If the answer is no, the question will be, then what are you going to do about it? And so the principle behind the No Child Left Behind Act is to set high standards, believe every child can learn, and measure to see if we're getting results. And Congress need not weaken such a good piece of legislation.
In 2002, former President George W. Bush signed a bill into law called No Child Left Behind. It was signed because of the proposed reasoning that the act would help kids succeed in school, and it would be a great contribution in raising the education cap. Now you might be wondering, what is No Child Left Behind? No Child Left Behind requires all government-run schools receiving federal funding to administer a statewide standardized test annually to all students. All students take the same test under the same conditions. All schools receiving Title I funding must make adequate yearly progress in test scores. The students' scores determine whether the school has taught the students well, or if the government needs to intervene. Well, so far all this sounds good, right? We will be able to know how our kids are doing.
And if the answer is yes, we all say great.
But after those few words and a little bit more detail,
if the answer is no, the question will be, then what are you going to do about it?
Things start to get a little skeptical. When I said earlier that everybody takes the test, I mean everybody. This includes people that are currently learning English and people that are in special ed. And to top that off, at least 95% of all students are to be tested for reading and mathematics, regardless if you're in special education or if you don't even know the language. That's just one of the 3 AYP requirements for public schools. I like to personally call these the 395s. The other 2 are the following. At least 95% of all students must meet the minimum annual target for meeting and exceeding standards for reading and mathematics. This means that this year's 6th graders must do better than last year's 6th graders, and next year's 6th graders must do better than this year's 6th graders. This cycle keeps continuing until 100% of kids are proficient in reading and mathematics by 2014. As ridiculous and unrealistic as that number may seem, the next one is also pretty interesting. At least 95% of all students in elementary schools must meet the adequate attendance rate, and as well as graduation rate for high schools. If Title I schools do not meet these requirements for 2 years, then they are put in something called Choice School Improvement Status. This means that on top of coming up with a plan to meet the requirements next year, the school has to give the students the opportunity to transfer to a different school. And on top of that, provide the transportation to get there. But that's not all. They also have to use part of their Title I funds for professional development within the teachers and the staff. If the school fails to meet AYP for 3 consecutive years, then they are put in something called Supplemental Services Improvement Status. So on top of providing all of the other requirements for Choice School Improvement Status, they must provide after-school programs and tutoring programs for the students from a state-approved provider. If the school fails to meet AYP for 4 consecutive years, then they are put in Corrective Action Improvement Status. So on top of providing everything else that I said earlier, the school has to do one of the following: fire the people responsible of a failure, improve a new curriculum, decrease a school's management authority, appoint an external expert to advise the school, or restructure the internal organization of the school. If you thought that was the last of it, then think again. Because if a school fails AYP for 5 years, then they must plan to implement one of the following. Close the school and reopen it as a charter school, fire the staff, including the principal, relevant to the failure of the school, contract with an outside entity to operate the school, turn over the school's operation over to the state education agency, or partake in another form of major reconstructuring that makes fundamental reforms. All of these implementations from every single status come out of the school funds.
It's been 10 years since the No Child Left Behind Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Bush. Today, its performance is beyond dispute. The act came with a massive infusion of new federal spending and federal control, but student achievement has been flat, and states have less flexibility today than before the act was passed. A big investment without much measurable return.
Well, I supported No Child Left Behind because it seemed like a good idea at the time. And as it happened, so did 90% of the Democrats in Congress and almost 90% of the Republicans in Congress. Who would want to leave any child behind? So the promise of the legislation seemed very great, and many people continued to believe in it for a long time. I stopped believing in it, and many of its original supporters still support it.
If you could propose a solution to No Child Left Behind policy, what would it be, or at least what problems would it address? I think initially the whole concept of 100% of students will meet or exceed on some sort of an assessment would have to be changed.
So a lot of people who supported No Child Left Behind probably really were well-intentioned. They wanted the federal government to make state school districts bring all kids to a high bar of proficiency by saying if you want federal money, you've got to have state tests, you've got to have high standards, and you've got to get all these kids educated. Many others probably realized, though, and because it was hard to miss, that in No Child Left Behind, essentially what it was telling states was really set low bars, or write easy tests, or set low standards that you call proficiency because you stay out of trouble under the law, you get even more money, and everybody comes out looking good except for the kids who actually are no better educated than they were before the law.
Those that were interviewed were educators, and they had their fair share of No Child Left Behind. Basically, it was a good idea, but it was executed completely wrong. Our current president, Barack Obama, is willing to change it.
I announced that my administration would take steps to reform No Child Left Behind on our own. This is one of the first and the biggest "we can't wait" announcements that we've made, because our kids in our schools can't be held back by inaction. I want to point out, by the way, the members of Congress who are here, they're ready to act, but we haven't been able to get the entire House and Senate to move on this. And I said back then, the goals of No Child Left Behind were the right ones. Standards and accountability, those are the right goals. Closing the achievement gap, that's a good goal. That's the right goal. We've got to stay focused on those goals, but we've got to do it in a way that doesn't force teachers to teach to the test or encourage schools to lower their standards to avoid being labeled as failures. That doesn't help anybody. Certainly doesn't help our children in the classroom.